What's up? What's up? I'm Dr. Omatma, host of Egg Meet Sperm, where we're busting fertility myths, sharing tangible tips for your fertility journey, and bringing you the most knowledgeable guests to support your journey to parenthood. This podcast is for both women and men because getting fertile as fuck is for both partners, don't you think? Remember, just listening to this podcast won't get you pregnant, but following the tips we share just may. Let's get you fertile AF so that you can co-create the family you dream of. And if your partner's not listening to this, make sure to share this episode with your partner. Hello and welcome to Egg Meet Sperm. I am so excited for my guest today, Michelle Kapler. She is a registered acupuncturist, traditional Chinese medicine practitioner, and board certified in reproductive health. She's also a certified feminist life coach, which we are going to talk a little bit about. Michelle is dedicated to helping people socialized as women examine their internalized beliefs. She's on a mission to shed light on how the socialization, along with diet, culture, healthism, and living in the other intersecting marginalized identities, impacts the fertility treatment process, creates unnecessary stress, anxiety, and leads to burnout. Welcome, Michelle. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I love having this conversation and I'm excited to get started.
Awesome. Well, let's start off on a very basic level. What the heck is burnout? Because I know that we throw this idea around or we throw these terms around, but is there actual definition that we can say, oh, okay, I kind of can wrap my head around this?
Yeah, of course. I'm a big fan of starting with the definition so we're all on the same page. So I'm all for that. So burnout is definitely something that's a bit of a buzzword right now. There's been a couple of really incredible publications in the literary world that have come out about it. And so a lot of people are talking about it. But classically, it's looked at more so in the context of workplace related or career related burnout. But I think that if you look at the definition of what burnout is, it can absolutely apply to the context of fertility treatment and the fertility treatment process. And so, to look at the definition of the World Health Organization and the way that they describe it, there's a couple of key factors that you're looking for. The first one is that you see some exhaustion coming out. So it's kind of this overwhelming sense of tiredness that you just can't shake. So it might be that you feel tired even if you go on vacation or you take a break, or even just, I've had a good night's sleep, but I wake up in the morning and I feel like I just can't because I'm so tired. The second thing from the WHO that they highlight is this sense of cynicism and detachment. It's kind of this feeling of numbness that you just feel really kind of meh about your fertility process. You just kind of lose a little bit of emotional sensation and you're just kind of like flat about the whole thing. And then the third thing that they highlight is this feeling of a lack of accomplishment. And to put that in the context of fertility treatment related burnout, it's kind of this thought of, well, I've been at this for 6 months or 2 years or 5 years or 7 years, and I've done 6 rounds of IVF and I've gotten nowhere and I've nothing to show for it. That theme can start to come out a little bit as well. And then to look at something that I've noticed in my clinical practice, being an acupuncturist who's focused exclusively on fertility for the last 12 plus years, I've also noticed this common theme of just simply a decline in emotional resilience. So it might mean that you're getting emotional really easily and you're unable to recover from it. Or maybe you're just snapping at people for reasons that you think maybe aren't actually that big a deal. Or it's just kind of this general sense of not being able to kind of quote unquote control your emotions in the way that you would like to. Those are kind of the four key factors that I look at to determine whether somebody is kind of either in full burnout or might be heading toward it.
Awesome. Yeah. So I think that helps a lot. I'm going to try to remember all of them. Exhaustion, feeling meh in general, emotional resilience, and there was the third one that I forget. What was
Yeah,
that
the
one?
third one is that sense of lack of accomplishment.
Oh,
So
yes.
kind of
Yeah.
I've been at this for a long time, but
Yeah.
I have nothing to show for it. That kind of thought pattern coming up over and over again.
Yeah. So I feel like this is really relevant to fertility because so often women and couples are on this journey for a long time and they do have this the only goal is a positive pregnancy test and a baby at the end of it. And I often feel like if we could have mini goals along the way, right? To be like, oh, I'm moving towards something rather than I'm not at the goal yet. Where's the goal? Where's the final thing that I really, really want? And I still don't have it. And I feel like that could potentially help. Is that what you have found as well?
There's a couple of things. I think that keeping that perspective in mind is definitely important. That idea of fertility and building a family is a marathon more than a sprint. And I mean, that kind of dates that false idea of it's just going to happen easily for me is often a shock for a lot of people. And it makes
Mhm.
sense because in high school sex ed, as
That's
women
all
and
we
people
learned.
socialized as women, we're taught like, well, you just look at a penis and you're going to get pregnant. And so, of course, it's a shock to us when we go and try to get pregnant and oh, it doesn't actually happen that easily. So, really keeping in mind that idea of it is a marathon and not a sprint, and keeping your expectations in line is important too. But one thing, or a couple of things that I often talk about in this process is within the context of fertility and building your family, there are so many things that are just out of control, or out of our control, I should say, rather. And especially in the context of fertility treatments, a lot of the people that I work with actually are using reproductive technologies and medical treatments to build their families. So IUI, IVF, using medications, going to the fertility clinic. But this can apply when you're not working with a fertility clinic as well. But it's that idea that there are so many factors in this process that are completely out of our control. So, if we're looking at IVF, for example, there's the part where the procedures and the test themselves are physically uncomfortable and they're invasive. There's the part where you're looking at this process that usually takes a lot longer than you were expecting. There's the financial toll it can take, it can be really expensive. And there's just so many unknowns. And all of that is, again, largely out of our control. So, the important thing, and one thing that I see as a key to avoiding or healing from burnout, is to focus on the things that we can control. And one of those things that's huge, that's really big in my work, is examining that internal dialogue in terms of how we are talking to ourselves during the process. And I can elaborate on that a little bit more, but just to kind of introduce it as a concept that we have this running inner dialogue of thoughts that can create a lot of emotions and sensations in our body. And that inevitably can lead to burnout during the process if we kind of leave that unchecked.
Yeah, there's so much here. Let's suppose that within ourselves, like someone's listening to this and they're like, oh my God, that's me. I have all of these things. What can we do to recognize A, that we're experiencing fertility burnout, and B, what can we do about it? How can we start to shift so that maybe I think it's more complicated than just, oh, we're going to shift our mindset. But I think that at least it can be a start to like help us shift into a different space.
Yeah, of course. And again, that's a really big question, of course. I mean, the concept of healing burnout and preventing burnout is something that is widely researched, and there's a lot of people doing a lot of incredible work in that space. And so there's always room for seeking out and finding what works for your particular life. And just to say, with the caveat that what I'll be doing today is speaking in generalizations. And so, of course, everybody has their own unique context in their fertility process. And so, it's important to keep that in mind. So, whatever I say today, just take what works for you and leave the rest. But a large part of my work, as I was mentioning earlier, is just to look at and notice and examine that inner dialogue. And so, what I mean by that is those semi conscious or often unconscious thoughts that just kind of run through our heads. And we just take them as absolute truth as we go through our fertility process. And I'm talking about things like, I am broken. Why can't my body just do this one thing that it's meant to do? I'm a bad partner. My partner's going to leave me. I don't deserve to be a parent because this isn't happening, quote unquote, naturally for me. And then there's that whole socialized belief when you're socialized as a woman that pregnancy is basically your only value in life. To make more humans is really the only thing that you're good for as a woman. Oh, yeah. And also being attractive to the opposite sex, that's in there too. But just that idea of your inherent worth comes from your ability to make more humans and, carry on the population. And so it's just important to begin to notice all of those things. And just by noticing when we're having those thoughts and actually questioning them and asking ourselves, well, is that really actually true? That can begin to shift things and change things if we're able to interrupt those thoughts. And there are lots of different methods to do this. I'm trained in a particular style of coaching and addressing this, but there are lots of options for people out there to do that. But essentially, we're looking to just question and then change what we feel isn't actually adding to our process. And just to say, I'm not advocating for kind of that idea of toxic positivity that we see so often in the fertility world. It's not about don't ever have a negative emotion or don't ever think bad thoughts because that's just part of the human experience. I think it's not useful to tell people that they should never feel sadness or grief or anger or resentment during anything that they're going through, but especially fertility. But it's just really looking for what's in our brains, what are our brains offering us that isn't actually in alignment with what we believe, and how is it maybe getting in the way of having a healthy mental state during this process?
Okay. So I agree. The toxic positivity is just so interesting because there's this sense of, oh, just affirmation, affirmation, affirmation. And sometimes is almost a disservice because we're pulling away from our actual internal experience. Is that what you mean by that?
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. And just
Okay.
to elaborate on that a little bit, it's my opinion. And again, this is my opinion alone based on my experience. But I think the idea of affirmations is actually technically a form of lying to yourself. In that, if you're repeating this thing over and over and over again that you don't really believe, it's not going to do anything. It doesn't really change anything in your mind. And so, when I'm working with people, and I'm going to give you a concrete example. Let's say I was talking to somebody and they kept having this idea of, I should be able to get pregnant without intervention, as in, I shouldn't need IVF. I should be able to do this, quote unquote, naturally. If they're having that thought, it's not realistic to tell them to just think positive thoughts like, I am a beautiful lotus flower opening to all the possibility of the universe. And just to say, if that works for you, amazing, and keep doing it. But if you're finding that it's not actually working for you, and by working for you, the way you can kind of test this is if you're saying something like, I shouldn't have to do IVF, I should be able to do this quote unquote naturally, it probably creates a negative emotion in your body when you're saying that to yourself. So it could be despair or sadness or grief or resentment or anger or any of those things that are normal on the spectrum of human emotions. The way you know if something is actually believable for you is if you kind of try on that new thought and it actually creates a positive emotional change for you, or at least a change out of that negative space or negative emotion that you're hanging out in. And so, for example, if you're going from, I shouldn't have to do IVF and I should be able to do this naturally, to, I am a beautiful goddess full of fertile potential, and that doesn't really create an emotional change for you, you might want to start with a change that's really, really small, something that is actually believable and realistic for you. And one thing that I really like to remind people of is I have a diagnosable and legitimate medical condition that requires medical treatment. And that just means that I'm living in a human body because human bodies get sick and human bodies need medicine sometimes. And human bodies just break down and don't always work the way that we would like them to. And for most people, making that tiny shift from this is actually something that I should be doing. And it's actually saying something about my inherent human worth. And it's making me into this person that I see as broken, shifting simply to, I have a legitimate medical condition that requires treatment. That in and of itself can create a shift. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, what are some of the causes of burnout? I feel like it's sort of obvious, but it's also a lot of people experience this and it's kind of creeping in. It's not like we wake up suddenly and we're like, wait, yesterday I was fine. Today I'm feeling burnout. It edges on us so slowly that sometimes we're not aware of it happening.
Yeah. And that can be true with anything to do with mental health or even physical health. A lot of the time, we're not like, I mean, when we're talking about infectious diseases, yes, that is how it works. But often with chronic mental health conditions or chronic physical health conditions, it is something that kind of slowly creeps in over time. And so I would say first, just that that is how the human body and the human mind works, unless there's something traumatic that happens. It's not usually a switch that just flicks, it's something that happens and builds over time. But to speak to the causes of burnout, as we were talking about earlier, there are some pretty obvious contributors to people struggling emotionally when they're going through fertility challenges. And I mentioned some things earlier, like the financial toll that it takes on people, the physical discomfort that people experience, the invasiveness, all of those things that are super obvious to anybody that's looking at somebody going through fertility challenges. And unfortunately, like I said earlier, most of those things aren't really in our control. There's really nothing that we can do about the waiting or the cost or the pain or the side effects or the diagnoses. That's just all kind of part and parcel with it. And there's not really much that we can do to change it at the end of the day. So, what I like to focus on is, again, something that slowly builds over time is that we just have that running inner dialogue of thoughts that aren't really useful to us and are essentially untrue if we ask ourselves. That's one aspect of it. And then there's also that interesting piece of exploring one's socialization and what those messages are that we have internalized that are contributing to those untrue thoughts that we are having about ourselves. So let's take, for example, that idea that is so common when people are struggling with fertility and building their family is that idea that it's something that a woman's body is quote unquote supposed to do and should be able to do quote unquote naturally. And that is the one thing that a woman's body should be able to do. And I think that looking at this from a couple of perspectives is important, but especially that socialization where we're looking at how we're told implicitly and explicitly from the time that we're young kids, especially when we're kids that are being socialized as girls, that that's really how it should be and what our job is in life. And so you really kind of take that in. And then you also combine it with this concept of what's known as healthism. And healthism, just to define that, is this idea that if somebody has a medical condition or an illness or something that comes up, and this isn't just infertility, this is any medical condition that somebody has, that there's this belief, and that's perpetuated by diet culture and influencers and people that are in the health and wellness field, that you should be able to follow a prescriptive set of actions to essentially cure your own illness. And that can be really problematic because people can end up with these long prescriptive lists of health endeavors that they're supposed to check off on this perfectionist list that they have of eating the right diet and doing the right exercises and taking the right supplements and moving their body in the right way. And then there's all the things that you should avoid. So don't eat these foods, don't drink too much alcohol, but don't stop drinking because you have to enjoy your life during this process because it might last 5 years. You never know. And then make sure that you don't get too stressed out, but don't pay too much attention to your stress because you know you have to live your life. And you end up with this idea that so many people, especially people socialized as women, take on as this list of check boxes that they have to make. And then if they don't get the outcome they are looking for, they ultimately look to this list as in, oh, well, what did I do wrong? What did I
Yeah.
leave off of this list? What did I not consider? And that really burns people out as well.
Yeah. And I think with fertility, I think it's really unique because I would say a great majority of the time, our clients don't really have a list of unhealthy. They're doing all of the things that they were told to do, like eat the healthy diet and do the exercise and do da, 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 da. And it still is happening. Like fertility can still be an issue, even with all of those things present. So I think to what you're saying, it's like, it's not really someone's fault or it's not a blame. It's just not happening. And it's okay that it's not happening. Possible, like the way I like to think about it is a puzzle board with a few puzzle pieces missing. And it's not like we need to drastically change everything that you're doing and have done up to this point. But really, we need to find those little puzzle pieces and like click the whole thing into place instead of, I don't know, I'm kind of not super into the diagnosis of it. It's more like, let's just figure out what your body is saying and how can we bring some balance and bring some next level optimization to it.
Yeah. And I think that, again, I don't want people to think that I'm advocating for just completely letting go of all of their healthy values. I'm not telling people that they shouldn't try to eat healthy foods or exercise or manage their stress because all of that has been explicitly demonstrated in research to be beneficial, not only in the context of fertility, but also from a health and longevity perspective. But I think that the message that I'm trying to get across here is that it's a thought error to tell people, and maybe people, well, sorry, that's a mistake. There are people out there that are telling people explicitly that if you just eat this diet, then you'll get pregnant. There are people out there that are actually saying that. And it's a thought error to take on this idea that if you just do this set of actions that it will fix your legitimate and diagnosable and treatable medical condition that you might need medical care for. And also further to that, that if you do need medical care, if you do need some medicine or some help or some guidance, that it doesn't mean that you're broken or that you're doing it wrong. It just means that you have a human body. And so, yes, I think that as an allied health professional, of course, we talk about diet and exercise and stress reduction. That's a very important part of things. But I just don't like to see people take it to this level where they're almost using it against themselves, where if they get a bad outcome or if they don't get pregnant that month or if something is happening, I've seen time and time again where people ultimately take it to this place of, okay, well, I ate a piece of cake at my grandmother's birthday last month, and maybe that's why I didn't get pregnant. Or I had a couple glasses of wine on my wedding anniversary, and oh, maybe that's why I didn't get any embryos in my IVF cycle. And oh, I had that one day where I was super stressed out and my boss emailed me, and then I cried in the bathroom, and maybe that's why I didn't get pregnant. And to me, that kind of approach to things that's full of blame and shame and self doubt is just completely untrue, but people do that all the time. And that is a big part of what essentially leads to burnout.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think what I hear you saying is like, it's not one action or one choice that you made. It's not even necessarily a string of choices because you might have made all of the right choices along the way. We're just present to like, here's what's happening. Let's figure out what we need to do differently to support your body. And
100%. And
it,
sometimes what we need to do differently is just to give ourselves a break,
yeah,
just to let ourselves off the hook and maybe entertain this idea that maybe it's not all on our shoulders to make this process go in a certain direction.
Yeah.
Like we can do the best we can, but it still might not go along our timeline that we would want or turn out in the way we would like, or we might need to use a different path to get to where we're going. And just detaching that from our inherent human worth.
Yeah. So I've heard you say a few times about this socialization as women that we've attached some sort of value to whether or not we're able to have children. And I'm curious about that because I've never thought about it that way. And I haven't necessarily had a conversation like that to have someone say to me, like, oh, but this is going to define me as a woman. So I'm curious about hearing more about that idea of being socialized to like, this is what you need to do as human in a female body.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And if you look throughout history, I mean, we've obviously come a really long way as women in terms of our choices and our ability to have autonomy and make our own decisions. I mean, even as compared to 100 or 200 years ago, it's really changed a lot. We can have our own bank accounts and we can vote and we can do all these, at least in North American culture. There are still some places in the world where that's not the case, but I'm assuming that most of your listeners are probably located in areas where that is the case. And so it's a little bit less explicit than it was throughout history. But if we look at things like if somebody is experiencing infertility and it's widely, I don't want to say accepted, but it's kind of widely spoken about that that means that you're broken as a person if you're reproductively not functioning in the way that you would like to. I guess the question is, why doesn't that apply to any other diagnosable medical condition? We have to think about why it's our fertility in particular. Because, for example, if somebody was nearsighted and they had to go to the optometrist and get glasses, we wouldn't be like, oh, you're broken because your eyes aren't working properly, or any other condition that can happen to people. And so I think it's important to kind of look at where that's coming from, where that idea is coming from. And again, it's kind of this underlying implicit socialization that we receive starting at a very young age that just kind of gets into our unconscious. So we were talking earlier about, for example, sex ed in high school. And I think it's really telling that kids that are being socialized as girls and who have female reproductive anatomy. I mean, I don't know about you, but growing up in high school sex ed, I was basically taught you can get pregnant at any time in your cycle. Just don't have sex. If you even look at a penis, you're going to get pregnant. And that's really all you need to know. And that's
Yeah.
really interesting because our bodies are so much more complex than that. Why aren't we teaching girls and little kids with female anatomies what it means to have a cycle and how that works and what ovulation is and how to recognize that and how to recognize our fertile window, and then mixing all of that with themes of sexuality and consent and how that plays into everything. And it's just really telling that even from a young age, there's so much information that's missing, except for, well, this is how you would get pregnant, and that's all you really need to know. Like that sends a pretty strong message that that's really the only information that's relevant. And that's what's going to be useful to carry on into your adulthood. Does that answer your question? I went
Yeah.
on a bit of a tangent there.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think that there is the lack of education for young women, especially, is lacking for sure, to say the least, right? And absolutely, grew up with the same ideas and the same lack of information. I think that I don't know if it's changed. Need to talk to a really young person right now, like a teenager who's like, actually, this is no longer happening. And that would make me so happy.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think that there are people out there that are doing really good work who are
yeah.
looking to change that. I mean, I look at the curriculum that's happening for my kids, and it's definitely changed and developed as compared to people of my generation. But what I see is that the result that that previous education has created is that women and people with eggs and ovaries who are coming into my clinical setting looking to get pregnant, I'm doing a lot of 101 education. And that's okay. I don't mind. It's totally fine. But to have to educate people in their late 20s and early 30s and even early 40s on, well, this is how you know when to have intercourse so you can get pregnant. It's 10 years into this, 10 plus years into this. It still shocks me that I have to give
Yes.
people that information at this stage in life, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it just goes to show us that we really have such little information about our own bodies. And if it was being made up for in college in some way, that would be great. But it's not. We don't get this education. And most women go through the fertility journey and they're like, oh my God, I know so much more now because of my fertility struggles that I wouldn't have learned otherwise. There is no other reason that we learn this information and like, oh, what's cervical mucus and how do I detect it and what does it mean? Just all of the questions. And
Yeah.
I feel like that knowledge can actually support this. Like, it's just such a miracle that babies exist. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like, on a very basic level, like the fact that egg ever meets sperm, the timing and all of the things that have to click into place. And then the sperm have to like make it through the protective barrier of the egg. I think when I first started learning about it, I was just almost in tears every single time because it's just so miraculous that there are so many humans on this planet
A
when
100%.
like
Yeah. And compare and contrast that to what we learn in high school, which is you can get pregnant just by looking at a
mhm,
person with a penis.
yeah,
So stay far, far away and don't go there. And that in and of itself is that comes from religious contexts and lots of things that
sure.
might not even align with what we believe. But it's just interesting to see how it kind of contradicts the reality of just how complicated it actually is to make
Yeah.
another human.
Yeah, and that there are some built-in mechanisms to not get pregnant every single time we ovulate, because God, that would be so much fun. Like, could you imagine, like, every time I have sex, I'm gonna get pregnant?
Oh my goodness.
That would
Yep.
just be horrible. So, it's sort of like our bodies have built-in mechanisms to make sure and ensure that we only have how many ever children we desire to, but that we have some choice about it. And it's not like an instant, it's always going to happen. It's always going to happen. And it's also not going to happen when our body is giving the signal of being burnt out or not having enough capacity to grow a healthy human, right? So I
Yeah.
feel like there are these built-in mechanisms that are keeping us from getting pregnant. And once we know what those mechanisms are, we can use them in our favor. If we understand ovulation and we understand what it means for us and our bodies and what the signs and symptoms are, then we can be like, oh, well, I know exactly when to have sex if I'm trying to have a baby, when not to have sex if I'm not trying to have a baby. And not to say that that's like as easy as it is, but that's a really good starting point, I feel like, to learn about our bodies, to understand that these ideas that we were kind of entrenched in when we were formulating what it means to be a woman, what our cycles mean, what sex means, if we just take all of those memories and put them in the trash can and then like get a new set of ideas and understandings about what's actually happening in our body and to
Yeah.
really approach it from a different perspective.
Yeah. And I would also say the other thing that I would want to mention, which is, we kind of explored that theme of your body's broken if you can't get pregnant. And then there's also this idea of fertility is a woman's problem. And that's another really
Yeah.
interesting one to explore because if you look at the statistics and the research, and it's not about assigning blame to either of the partners, obviously, but if you look at female factor and what that accounts for in cases of diagnosed infertility, I think the latest statistics that I read were that female factor was approximately 30%, male factor was approximately 30%, and then the other 40% is either unknown or a combination of both. So if you look at the numbers, it's about 50-50 down the middle in terms of
Yeah.
male factor versus female factor. But what I see actually practically play out, and this is super fascinating, is that about 95% of my clinical patients as an acupuncturist are the people with the eggs and the ovaries. And further to that, if there's a case where it is diagnosed male factor, as in both partners have gone to the fertility clinic and the uterus is good, the ovulation is good, the female hormones are good, check, 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 everybody's fine on that side, but it's male factor, so it's morphology or sperm count or
Mhm.
something, liquefaction, any of the DNA fragmentation, something like that has been diagnosed. It's interesting to observe that it's still the woman, it's still the people with the eggs and the ovaries that are coming in for treatment, that are eating the diet, that are doing the yoga, that are trying to do this list of things to optimize that side of things. And meanwhile, the male partner's like, yeah, I'm still gonna smoke a pack a day and drink 6 beers every night, even though that's been demonstrated in research to have a profoundly negative effect on
Right.
semen and sperm health. They're still not really willing to make the change. And we have to ask ourselves, well, where did that come from?
Yeah.
Like, why is it culturally acceptable for things like that to happen? And it's because of this old and false idea that fertility is ultimately a woman's problem.
Yeah. I think that's totally true. And I feel like men overwhelmingly have this message that nothing they do is going to make a difference. Right. So they're like, yeah, we're going to do IVF anyway. And IVF's going to take care of it. So why do I need to take any responsibility? I'm going to walk into the clinic, give my sperm, and be done. Versus in reality, if we're thinking about creating a healthy human, regardless of where the medical condition lies or where the medical responsibility is, I feel like both people have to be equally responsible because at the end of the day, whether or not you have good sperm may help determine whether or not you get pregnant and how quickly that happens. There's so much more, like the healthy epigenetics, healthy DNA, that is going to actually contribute to whether or not you have a healthy baby.
Yeah,
So if we're talking
absolutely.
about in our practice, we're like, it's a game changer. It's either if you're in a partnership, your partner needs to be part of the process or goodbye.
Mm,
And the worst case or like the biggest story I have is kind of crazy. He was 42 or something and his sperm were totally normal, quote
mm,
unquote,
mhm,
and smokes, drinks, smokes marijuana. He had extremely fatty liver condition,
mm,
heart
mhm,
disease, high cholesterol, diabetes. Literally every single thing we tested was abnormal, medically abnormal, while the sperm were fine. So he was told, it's not you. And he
mhm.
comes to see us, and we're like, there's no way. Like, this is just not happening. This is going to take a drastic change. And he's like, well, I'll quit smoking marijuana, but everything else stays. And I'm like, you're fired. Goodbye.
Oh
I
my
I
goodness.
literally was like, here's a refund. I don't want to see you again. And the woman is like, no, but what's happening right now? You can't fire us. You're our only hope. And I was like, this man says he's not willing to do a single thing except quitting marijuana. That is very low on the totem pole. There's going to need to be way more changes than that.
Well, I think
And
that highlights a really interesting aspect of being able to do these tests is incredible. Having medical technology at our disposal is so incredible. I mean, being able to use testing and medications and interventions that correspond with these tests is absolutely miraculous. And so I think that it's good that we have it. But it's also important for people to recognize that it's limited. There's still only so much that we understand according to medical technology. There's still so much unknown. So much of human reproduction is an absolute mystery. And so if you're hanging on that one semen analysis result that only gives us a small piece of what the information actually is, then you can end up in problematic situations where somebody's like, well, I'm fine because the test said I'm fine, even though there might be
Yeah.
more to explore.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate, definitely what we've talked about today in terms of it being only a woman's issue, I think we're very far from it in science,
Mhm.
but our mindsets around it have not changed fully. So there are going to be times when maybe you've even gotten IVF. And I've had 32-year-olds that are told, oh, it's your eggs. And I'm like, well, did they do a sperm test?
Yeah.
Like really basic things. Did they test the
Yeah.
sperm? Did they
I
do a
think
DNA fragmentation on the sperm?
Yeah. Well, one
So,
example that I see coming in so commonly, which is really, really sad and just guts me every time, is people who are experiencing recurrent miscarriage.
mhm.
And even the medical community's response is to do a bunch of testing on the woman, but not really take the sperm into account. And what that means is that the woman, the person with the eggs and the ovaries, is blaming themselves and turning themselves inside out and backwards to figure out what quote unquote she did wrong to cause these recurrent miscarriages, even though it's just as statistically likely that it could be related to the sperm.
Yeah, and let's not stop at the sperm because there's so much data about men's blood sugar levels, liver enzymes, homocysteine levels. There's so many factors in men that have been connected to recurrent pregnancy loss. So they can have completely normal or even great sperm and have some of these underlying issues that will then cause pregnancy loss in the female.
Yeah.
And this recurrent loss is one of our specialties, and we see a lot of it. And it always blows my mind because 95% of the time, one of these issues the guys had in
Mm.
the woman that's having pregnancy loss.
Yeah.
So it has always been like, what? That's so crazy. And the guys, luckily, the guys that we see are more supportive and more like willing to make the effort. But I think it's so important to remember that just because the female is carrying the child, it doesn't mean that the male partner is not equally responsible. And it's a hard concept to get because it's like, well, it's your body. You can do whatever you want.
Well, I think that's the question right there. Even
Yeah.
though medical science and research is telling us factually that it's 50-50 a
Yeah.
contribution, even in
Yeah.
cases of miscarriage, it's that old idea. It's that
Yeah.
old socialized idea that it's the woman's responsibility to get
Mhm.
pregnant and stay pregnant and have the babies. Like that's
Yeah.
really where it comes from.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This was a riveting conversation. And I do think that some of these deep seated beliefs need to change. And I hope that the more we have these conversations, the more that we kind of are helping the women that we're working with, they're shifting their mindset. And hopefully the next generation will just have a different mindset and grow up
Yeah.
with a different belief system because,
Yeah.
oh Lord, the stuff
I
that
know,
we've
I'm with
created
you.
in
Not
our
to like leave things
lifetimes.
on a heavy note, but I mean, there are people that are doing really incredible work. And I think that people are beginning to see people's minds change and shift. And it's just up to us to be out there banging on doors and making podcasts and offering people these ideas that maybe in the hopes that we can change people's minds one person at a time.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the work that you are doing in this space. And I know that you have a lovely gift for our listeners. which is the Fertility Stress Relief Toolkit. Do you want to share a little bit about what is in that toolkit?
Yes, of course. This little toolkit is a collection of a couple of things that I've put together. I kind of like to have a little bit of a buffet for people to choose from in terms of what they need. So I have a bunch of written guides in there. So if people need help making a decision, there's a guide for that. There's a guide for how to have a conversation that's tough with your partner. There are a couple of videos in there on past lectures that I've done on burnout specifically and how to manage stress throughout fertility. There are a couple of audio guided visualizations and meditations that people can use to process negative emotions. There's kind of something for everybody in there. So all you need to do is head over to my website and you can grab that for free. And then it's kind of a smorgasbord of take what you like and leave what you don't.
That's awesome. That sounds like such a great toolkit. I'm like, okay, I'm about to go download this.
Love it.
Awesome. Well, for those of you listening, thank you for joining us. Make sure to tune in for the rest of the week to get amazing tips from Michelle, and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks for having me.
Was that an amazing episode or what? Make sure to check our show notes so that you can link up with our guests. And if you're not a part of our secret Fertile AF community, you can join for free via the link in our show notes. Last but not least, have you showed us some love lately? It would mean the world to us if you could share and review our podcast. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time on Egg Meets Sperm. Peace.